Revelation chapter 3 opens with a message to the church in Sardis. Now, as you can see from the map, and again, I thank Todd Bolin for almost all the illustrations, most of the illustrations. Patmos, Ephesus would be the first place that they would deliver the message. Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis is next on the list. Sardis was in Lydia, so was Thyatira, but we dealt with Thyatira before. So here you can see a closer picture from Thyatira to Sardis. And here are just some excavations of some ruins from Sardis. Some places you don't have a whole lot of excavations you can show, but Sardis, you've got some big ones, including the gymnasium, the city gymnasium, which was the prime piece of real estate in the city. And next to it was the synagogue, which is coming up. Here are the city coins. You can see the lovely serpents, but the synagogue we're going to talk about. Here, the problem in Sardis was they were a dead church. Sardis thought it had it all together. I mean, the Jewish community there was accepted. The synagogue was the largest known in the Roman Empire, the length of a football field. So prime piece of real estate in the city, right next to the city gymnasium. We'll have a picture of the remains of the synagogue soon. But just as the Jewish community was tolerated, so apparently were the Christians. Is that always good for us to be tolerated? I mean, I'm glad for it. I want us to be tolerated. I think Luke wrote Luke Acts urging that the church would be tolerated. But having said that, sometimes when we are too tolerated, we kind of tend to blend into the things around us. So here's the later synagogue at Sardis, 4th century remains, but apparently already in this period, you've got probably a big synagogue there, massive synagogue. And here is a mention of a God-fearer. So you actually had a number of Gentiles. You have this in Aphrodisias and some other places in Asia Minor too, where a number of Gentiles were feeling so comfortable with Judaism, they were regularly attending, sometimes even sponsoring the local synagogue. This was surrounded by a sophisticated form of paganism. Greeks identified the early Asiatic mother goddess with, by Asiatic, Phrygian especially in Central Asia Minor, with Demeter. So you had a lot of syncretism, overlap between different kinds of cults or religions. Early 1st century Romans apparently identified her with Livia. Dominant paradigms are hard to fight. Astrology, for example, was part of the science of their day. So if you were pro-science, you might be pro-astrology. Now, I am pro-science. We should be pro-science. But not everything that's always been done in the name of science has always been ideal. Obviously, way better today than it was then. But dominant paradigms, the point is, are hard to fight. And a lot of paganism in Sardis, just like everywhere else in the Roman world. So here's remains of the Temple of Aphrodite. You can see just from the remains and from the size of the people in the picture, it was pretty big. And the title of temple warden given to Sardis, Ephesus also had a title like that at a different point. Here's a coin of Sardis with the head of Augustus, and Augustus was worshipped as a god in a lot of the cities of Roman Asia Minor. You have a reputation of being alive, is said to the church in Sardis, but you're really dead. Now, suggested backgrounds of the language, there's a number of them that relate to what was locally practiced or understood in the city of Sardis. There was a local emphasis on Persephone and Demeter. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, who was raped by Hades, taken down to the underworld, but Demeter and Hades ended up with a timeshare agreement through which Persephone spent half the year in the underworld, half the year in the rest of the world. Demeter mourning when Persephone was in the underworld, and so the crops were barren, the trees were barren, and so on. That's winter. But when she gets Persephone back, that's summer. Very nice timing. Well, the local emphasis on dying and rising of Persephone, not in the bodily sense like Jesus, and not in a once for all sense like Jesus, but seasonal revivification. But that's not unique by any means to Sardis. That was a common Greek myth. Another emphasis that some have suggested as background for this, you have a glorious Acropolis across from the necropolis where the dead were buried. So when you're in Sardis, you can just look out over the scenery and you see that's where they bury the dead people. So there might be a reminder of dead and alive in that sense. Sardis also was rebuilt after it was devastated by an earthquake in the 60s. That was also true of Laodicea, but some people, well, probably that's not a very likely background for this, but some people have suggested that. Local citizens would identify with the reputation of the city, and they might understand that they had once been really powerful under Croesus, king of the Lydians. Now they had an empty reputation. But the most important part of this by far is what we see in the context. That is, there's a vivid contrast with Jesus in 1:18 and 2:8. Jesus, the first and the last, who died and came to life. So instead of being like Jesus, who was dead and is now alive, the church in this city has a reputation of being alive, but now they're dead. And he doesn't mean that all of them are dead or that they're literally dead, but this is where we get the expression of a dead church. Now, you look at the walls of ancient Sardis, and pretty steep, as you can see. If you love rock climbing, you might enjoy that. But it was pretty hard to scale the walls of Sardis. And so Sardis had once been considered like an impregnable fortress. Again, you wouldn't want to have to climb what's left there. But there are pastoral issues with sleeping Christians. When I'm preaching and I find out that people are called lay people because they're all asleep during my sermon, no, that's not the meaning of it. Anyway, but he says, if you don't wake up, I'm going to come on you like a thief. Now, the main background for the expression is Jesus' teaching about coming judgment. And what could happen to Sardis could be a foreshadowing of the coming judgment, just like Jesus' judgment on Jerusalem was, or God's judgment on Jerusalem was a foretaste of the coming judgment at the end of the age. So Matthew 24, and also I believe it's Luke 12, if the owner of the house had known at what time the thief was coming in the night, he would have kept watch. The Son of Man is coming in an hour when you don't expect him. And that's echoed elsewhere in the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 Peter chapter 3. Here, for Sardis, and also more globally speaking, in Revelation 16, in the context of Armageddon. So judgment is coming. And he warns the church, if you don't wake up, I'll come on you like a thief. Even though Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5 says, we're not in the darkness, we're in the light. So we're not the ones who are asleep. The church in Sardis had gone to sleep. And in terms of a local background for the expression that's been proposed, remember we saw the unscalable walls or barely scalable walls. The proud Sardians knew the history of their city, and they would remember that the city had been captured twice in its history, both times because it was caught off guard. So I don't think that's as as central as the thief in the night saying of Jesus, but Sardians would be sensitive to the idea of being caught unprepared, not watching, not being ready. Jesus says, there are some of you, though, who do walk with me. You'll be dressed in robes of white. So sometimes we speak of dead churches. That doesn't mean that everybody in the church is dead. Often there's a remnant there who's still trying to keep it alive. And that's not a bad idea if the church can be revived. I mean, Jesus wants this church to wake up, but it's not everybody's calling. And I suppose the people were there. I mean, they didn't have cars back then. You couldn't just commute to a church in another city. That'd be a pretty long walk. Anyway, people wore white and or linen in temples especially. And so some have proposed that this means that the faithful will share in the New Jerusalem, the temple city. Although pretty much, the martyrs are dressed in white in the book of Revelation. I mean, lots of people are dressed in white in the book of Revelation, but those are supposed to be the good guys. You see me dressed in dark clothes, just happens to be what I'm wearing, but someday I'll be dressed in white. And again, the idea historically goes back to a contrast between day and night. Night being darker and day being brighter. But he also says, those who walk with me, I won't erase their names from the book of life. And here's just an illustration provided of papyrus with the writing washed away. Things could be erased. And now we're going to get to see an even better example. So on some inscriptions, the name of Domitian. Domitian was probably the emperor when Revelation was written. There's some dispute about that. That's the majority view. But after Domitian's death, he became decidedly unpopular because of some things he'd done during his life. And so they went back and chiseled out his name. That was a long-standing custom, actually. Some pharaohs did that with earlier pharaohs, and so on. And yeah, here's an example from Egypt, and here's another inscription. That's the same one. Okay, push the button the wrong way. So, not being blotted out of the book of life, what does that mean? Well, it's only promised to the remnant. So, what does that mean for the rest of the church? Presumably means they weren't saved, to use our language today. So he speaks of them being, when he speaks of being blotted out of the book of life, that image goes back to Exodus, where it may be talking about dying, or it may be talking about out of God's book of what in the Psalms and elsewhere in the Bible, and then subsequently in Jewish tradition, the book of life for eternal life. So Moses says to God, please forgive my people's sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you've written. God says, whoever sinned against me, I'll blot out of my book. Not going to blot you out, Moses. And so here are just some references to the heavenly book, both in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and in the early Jewish setting. First Enoch Jubilees, the Qumran War Scroll, all of which are pre-New Testament, and the idea continued beyond that. Well, what might they think of beyond that locally? Well, hearers might think of citizen registers. They were common in Asia. How can Paul prove that he's a Roman citizen? Well, probably he carries a little thing with him, but if all else fails, people could always send back to Tarsus and check, because there were registries of people who were born there as citizens. Sardis had a history with royal archives, but here the citizen registry would be more relevant. But in some places, and this might be known about in Sardis, in some places the names of errant citizens would be deleted from the register before their execution. You don't want to dishonor one of your own. They're not our own. We can deal with them as needed. But Jesus says, those who walk with me, I'll clothe them in robes of white, and I won't blot them out of the book of life, but I'll confess them before my Father. Well, here again, Jesus is evoking things that he'd already said when he was with us on earth. In Matthew chapter 10, whoever acknowledges or confesses me before others, I will acknowledge or confess that one before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I'll disown before my Father in heaven. So today, we don't want to be a dead church. We don't want to be like Sardis. We want to awake. And what Jesus says to the church in Sardis, remember the things you had from the first. Awaken. For us to awaken means going back to God's word, going back to what God has already declared. And when we go back to that, it can wake us up, tell us what God's standards really are. So we don't just blend into the values of the world around us, we follow the values of God.